So today's agenda, we're going to do a quick overview of NTI. We're going to talk about the impact of trauma on attachment. We're going to practice some concepts and tools. We're going to tell you how to access NTI and then answer any questions that you might have. Okay. And we have a couple polls built in, but I'm not sure that these worked. Okay, so we're going to talk about today what we hope that you'll be able to get out of this. So we're going to identify the features of the Nti training and some of the skills that can be applied as you're working in child welfare and mental health organizations, and also the skills and knowledge that you could pass on to parents, or if you're a parent, that you can use in your own parenting. We're going to define three.
Oh, sorry, Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah, we're going to define three characteristics of an adoption competent child serving professional with a focus on the impact of trauma and attachment on development, mental health, and behavior, and identify three interventions that professionals can utilize to educate parents to support attachment, attunement, and promote felt safety.
And real quick, Lisa, we do have the ability to do the poll if you want to. We just have to launch it. I can launch it if you want me to.
Okay, sure, go right ahead. Thank you.
Sure. All right, so you should have, hopefully, a poll showing up on your screen. I hope it does. And then just answer the question, and that will help us have an understanding of who you are. I think there are two questions here. What best describes your current role? And then what do you know about NTI? And we'll give just another few seconds.
But what best describes your role? Others, like.
Yeah, well, that's,
Wow.
I think we have a lot of peer specialists and support folks, so that's great.
Terrific. A lot of people who've heard about NTI, and a good number who don't know anything, and somebody heard about it and started. So hooray for you. And we're going to be sure to tell you about NTI in this presentation.
Share the results with you all. I know we could see them. I don't know if y'all could. So,
okay.
All right. Thank you guys for sharing that information. And for those of you not familiar with NTI, good news, you'll learn a little bit about it. So.
For sure. Oh, we have somebody from Maine. Welcome, Maine. I worked in Maine. Maine is my state. So happy to have you here. Yeah, terrific. Okay. All righty. So let's talk a little bit about the Center for Adoption Support and Education. That's our parent organization. It was created in 1998 to provide post-adoption counseling and education services to families in Maryland, Northern Virginia, and Washington, D.C. It's a private nonprofit services agency, envisioning that everyone touched by foster care and adoption has access to the adoption competent support necessary to navigate the lifelong journey. The National Adoption Competency Mental Health Training Initiative, or NTI, builds on the firm foundation of unique expertise and core values of CASE. And that's what we're here to talk with you about today. To learn more about CASE, you can visit our website at www.adoptionsupport.org. And through our work with CASE, through the years since 1998, we've really seen a need for change in how we address the mental health needs of children. The Children's Bureau grant that we received was a great opportunity to help address these gaps. We saw what you know about NTI. What do you know about NTI? And Don, why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. So one of the things that we know through our 25 years of service really is that child welfare and mental health professionals serving children, youth, and their foster, adoptive, and guardianship families often need additional training to enhance their understanding of complex issues around adoption. Issues like attachment, trauma, loss, grief, identity, and many other issues that complicate or contribute to social emotional development and well-being. So NTI, which again is the National Adoption Competency Mental Health Training Initiative, and we're going to say NTI from now on, improves collaboration between service systems, both child welfare and mental health, leading to real practice change and improved outcomes through the support of a shared language designed to address the unique challenges of that these families face. NTI improves collaboration, and we're just very excited to really have this opportunity to share with you about it, and also some of the tools and resources from it. So next slide.
Somebody in the chat said they can't see the slides. Did you end the poll?
I did end the poll. Yeah.
Okay. Can folks, somebody give me a heads up or thumbs up if you could see the slides?
Hold on here. Let's see if I can stop sharing. Oh, sorry, guys. Is it now gone? You have to close the poll. Oh, so yeah.
Gone. Okay, great. Okay, thank you. Oh, all righty, very good.
So the question really is, why is specialized training needed? And, you know, I want to say, first of all, we don't want to pathologize adoption. We know that adoption is a significant protective factor for families, for children and families. But we also know that children who've experienced early adverse experiences, those who've had losses and broken attachments, often have elevated risks for developmental health, social, emotional, and behavioral challenges. So I want you to think about, in your own either personal or professional experience, have you or your staff or coworkers experienced something that tells you that enhanced adoption competency is needed in your work or in the lives of the families that you serve? So if you would share that in the chat, we'll take a look at that in a second. You want to move forward, Lisa? Mm-hmm. So children and youth who are moving toward or have achieved adoption, as we said, often have diverse unmet mental health needs. Adoptive parents cite competent mental health services as one of their greatest unmet needs. Child welfare, adoption, social workers, and mental health therapists serving these children and their families often have a limited understanding, again, like I said before, around the complex issues of loss and grief and attachment and identity. The impact of these experiences and challenges compromises well-being and family stability. And you can see on your screen some of the examples of ways in which this is the case. These problems are magnified by the fact that many behavioral health professionals do not receive adequate training in the needs of foster, adoptive, and guardianship children. So I can see in the chat, we have a lot of people who commented, you know, that they understand and have seen the need for enhanced adoption competency. Bonnie says, would have been helpful for my adopted parents 40 years ago. And I hear what you're saying, Bonnie. I think a lot of people say that particularly once they've had this training, they really have an understanding they didn't have before. All right, so Lisa. So some of you hopefully are familiar with Debbie Shug. Debbie Shug is an adoptive parent. She's also an advocate in the field. And she's going to share with us a little bit about her experience working with a therapist who did not have an adequate understanding of adoption.
Oh, sorry, something went wrong.
Oh.
Okay, what went wrong?
When you shared your screen, did you optimize for sound and video?
I did.
Oh.
I did. Let's see. Maybe if I stop share and play it.
Of course, it's worked every other time.
It has. Yes, it has. Nope. Okay, hold on one sec. Let me see if I can.
Is the PowerPoint saved to your desktop? Yeah.
Yep, that's where I'm playing it from. Let me just. There we go. Let's try it this way. Love when we have technical issues.
Oh, it always happens.
There we go.
The girls were assigned therapists from their county, which was not the county we lived in, so we had to travel out of county every week for their therapy appointments.
One of my daughters who has a significant history of sexual abuse was assigned to a male therapist, which I found frustrating because she was terrified of men. But we would take them. We were doing what we were told by the social workers. So we took them to therapy every week, and they each went into their own therapist, and I stayed in the waiting room. And then they were brought back out to me when they were done, and we didn't know any better, so that's what I did. But I asked, so what did you talk about? And they said, well, that's confidential. And I was, oh, well, how can I help them if I don't know what you talked about? And so we would take them home from therapy, and we'd have huge behaviors in the car and a lot of self-harming behavior for one of my daughters, and a lot of kind of acting out aggressive behavior from the other, but without a lot of guidance in terms of what was happening. It was like kind of this big secret that was going on in there for 45 minutes every week that we weren't privy to. It was very frustrating.
So has anybody noticed, have had that situation in your work with kids and families, or in your life?
We like
Yes.
to give it as the big black box of therapy, where kids go for 55 minutes and parents have no idea what happens to them and aren't involved in the process at all. And I think what's important here is to realize that, oh, so real quick, Monica, no, Bonnie is saying, I dealt with my biological son when he was in therapy, so similar experience. So here's what we want to say. This, unfortunately, Deb's experience is not uncommon. We've worked with adoptive parents who have been to 6, 7, 8 therapists before they found one who got it. And the reality is that the lack of competency in this arena has often done more harm than good for foster, adoptive, and guardianship families. It's why we're really excited to talk about this Nti training that we developed. So a little bit about our training. So Nti is web-based, it is self-paced, and it is free training. And we have trainings for mental health and child welfare professionals. So Nti is comprised of 2 complementary and aligned curricula. The child welfare training is 20 hours with an additional 5 hours for supervisors focused on transfer of learning to infuse the knowledge and skills they learn in day-to-day practice. The training for mental health professionals is 30 hours and includes 2 additional modules, one on assessment and treatment planning and one on therapeutic parenting strategies. And then we also, particularly in the curriculum for mental health professionals, have a number of treatment models that we discuss. We're not providing trainings in these models. Rather, we're providing information about treatment models that have been found to be useful with this population. What we understand is that this is your toolbox, and it's important to understand that one intervention does not work for all children, youth, or families. And so Nti provides a whole wealth of different tools and strategies and interventions that can be used in your work with children and families. All right, Lisa, I'm gonna let you talk a little bit about trauma.
Okay. So what is a traumatic event? I'm going to talk about child trauma. And if you are working with kids who have come from hard places, foster care, adoption, guardianship, kinship care, if you are an adoptive parent or a foster parent or a guardianship parent, you have probably dealt with kids who've experienced trauma. So a traumatic event is a frightening, dangerous, or violent event that poses a threat to the child, actually to their life or to their integrity, their body integrity. Witnessing a traumatic event that threatens the life or physical security of a loved one can also be traumatic. This is particularly important for young children as their sense of safety develops around perceived safety of their attachment figures. So if a child is in a home where there's domestic violence, where the child is not being harmed in any way, but there's a lot of domestic violence going on, they will experience that as a traumatic event. Traumatic experiences can initiate strong emotions and physical reactions that can persist long after the event happens. Children may feel terror, helplessness, or fear, as well as physiological reactions such as the heart pounding, vomiting, loss of bowel or urine control, these things that really persist for much longer periods, even when they're in a safe situation. Children who experience an inability to protect themselves or who lacked protection from others to avoid the consequences of the traumatic experience may feel overwhelmed by the intensity of the physical and emotional response. Even though adults work hard to keep children safe, dangerous things still happen. And when that danger comes from within the family, such as domestic violence, physical abuse, sexual abuse, substance abuse or use, it really creates a lot of trauma and stress in the child's body. So what's the impact? What's the impact on our kids? Again, some of you are probably either parenting or working with kids and families who have had this experience. And yeah, what do you see? What have you noticed? You can put your thoughts in the chat box, or if you'd like to, raise your hand and speak out loud, we're happy to take your comments. So traumatic experiences can initiate those strong physical reactions. Again, what's going on in the body? What happens in the body? And then how does the child express that trauma? So children who suffer from these traumatic experiences often have reactions that seem way over the top to us, right? They have no sort of ability to regulate, self-regulate, and do what we might expect them to behave in, quote unquote, a typical way for their age. Without treatment to trauma and the effects of trauma, the brain and the nervous system really, they get changed. The brain changes. The research shows that the brain gets rewired by trauma. And it's hard to attach, and it's hard to have social interaction. It's hard to regulate your system when you're in that fight or flight state. And that's what happens to a lot of the kids. Research shows that trauma survivors, child trauma survivors, can be more likely to have long-term health problems like diabetes and heart disease, or to die at an earlier age, or to take part in really high-risk behaviors, super high-risk behaviors, substance abuse, sexual acting out, running away. A lot of these behaviors that really can be long-term and damaging to children. Adult survivors of traumatic events may also have difficulty in establishing really fulfilling relationships. Then they just can't attach, they can't settle. Their whole nervous system is on fire. Did we have some comments, Dawn?
We do. We have some comments. So examples of what happens with trauma: lack of ability to trust anyone, panic attacks, anger as a first reaction, loss of learning, or maybe difficulty learning, loss of sleep or difficulty with sleep.
Yeah, great examples, all those things. How do you pay attention in school when your whole nervous system is wired for fight or flight?
Mm-hmm.
That's really hard, and that becomes problematic for parents and for in the classroom. And certainly in the classroom where the teacher doesn't have maybe an understanding of the impact of trauma and attachment, or any knowledge of what went on in the child's history. And so they just see the kids as acting out or bad kids, or maybe, give them a diagnosis of ADHD, where really what we're talking about is trauma, PTSD. So developmental trauma disorder is has been recommended for inclusion in the DSM manual, and it's characterized by 7 domains. And the thinking is this really better explains what's going on for children than a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, it's characterized by these 7 domains for children who are exposed to complex trauma. And complex trauma is trauma that happens repeatedly. So a child who is in a domestic violent situation where their home has been violent for many months or many years. If the child is the victim of sexual abuse or physical abuse, if there's a lot of yelling and screaming and just total dysregulation in the house altogether. In terms of neglect, where the child has to fend for themselves and try to find food, all those kinds of things. It's complex trauma. So it affects attachment, biology, what's happening in our system. As I mentioned, trauma rewires the brain. It impacts affect regulation. How do I sort of modulate my, how do I regulate myself? Which also leads to behavior control. How do I behave? Oftentimes kids use behavior as a way of expressing what's going on inside. It impacts their cognition. It's hard to think when all you're concerned about is your safety. It impacts their self-concept. Why is this happening to me? Why did this, why was I hurt in this way? Why was I abused or neglected? Why didn't my mother love me? Why was I left? Why was a choice made that she would use drugs instead of care for me? I must be bad. That's internalized as there's something wrong with me, oftentimes. And again, you might have experienced this in your work or your families. Trauma impacts attachment, creates insecure attachment patterns, reactive aggression towards authority figures and peers. There's difficulty empathizing with another's feelings, and oftentimes causes boundary issues. That it's hard to attach. Again, it's hard to attach when your whole system is lit up in fight or flight. Not worried about attaching, we're worried about about surviving, actually. And I'm happy to answer any questions as we sort of move through this. Trauma rewires the brain and it affects our biology. It can cause mood swings, have trouble calming down. In my spare time, I'm a therapist here in upstate New York. And yesterday I was talking with a family who adopted a little girl from Russia when she was 3 and had been found wandering the streets, and she's now 21. And they say she goes from 0 to 200 miles per hour in a split second. And they never know what is going to set her off. And she's been doing this since she was 3 years old. So those extreme mood swings and then trouble calming down. How do you come down from this? And it could be, she could be set off from something as simple as, hey, honey, it's dinner time. And she just explodes. Things that are really sort of unreasonable if you take a sort of a typical situation with a typical child who's been who hasn't experienced that complex trauma. They have difficulty identifying and communicating emotion. Often expresses as depression or anxiety. Problems managing anger. Anger is a real easy emotion to go to because it tends to cover things like fear and hurt. Anger is a much less vulnerable state than fear and hurt. Trauma affects regulation. There's impaired brain development. Again, it rewires the brain. There's an imbalance in the neurochemistry of the brain and the body. Lots of physical complaints, headaches, stomach aches, joint pain, tired, right? The kids are really tired when they shouldn't be, or you don't expect them to be. Sensory processing difficulties, kids who have like trouble with tags on their shirts or trouble being touched or want to be touched. So those really difficult sensory issues. Trauma impacts the ability to control behavior. We see this a lot: impulsivity, lack of exploration, oppositional defiant behaviors, high-risk behaviors, self-injury, drugs, alcohol, having sex early and in a dangerous fashion, having sleeping or eating difficulties, and somebody mentioned that earlier in the chat. It impacts the ability to be present. So there's this depersonalization or derealization, dissociation, fight, flight, or freeze, right? The dissociation is I cannot take it to be in my body, so I have to disappear. And you can see this in children's faces and feel it in their energy. Like suddenly they're gone. They're just not there anymore. There's a diminished sense of awareness of one's own body and body states, excessive daydreaming and spacing out, all the characteristics of dissociation. Children who Yeah. Children who have experienced trauma often have a negative self-concept. They have difficulty thinking, the cognitive facility. They can't think because their brain has been scrambled. They've been rewired. That working memory, flexibility, focused attention, self-reflection, and problem solving become very difficult. They have a shortened sense of the future. Really, what the only thing they're worried about is what's happening right now. So, Don, let's take a look at some of the evidence-based practices. And these are evidence-based practices that are built into NTI's training.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. Okay, so you want to go to the next one?
Yep.
And I want to say this, first of all, that there has been a lot of study done on lots of different interventions. Not necessarily all of them have been well studied with adoptive families. So where we have that information, we have shared it with you. I mean, in terms of the interventions in our training, and interventions that are likely to really have some positive impact with this population. And I know Lisa said it earlier, but again, there's no one approach that works for everybody. And so that's why we're providing lots of different strategies and interventions for you. All right, so the first one is called collaborative problem solving. This is not an intervention you would use with an infant. It's really for children who, have some, understanding of kind of what's going on in the world, because it requires interactions between parents and children, particularly verbal interactions to some degree. So collaborative problem solving, or CPS, was developed by Drs. Ross Green and Stuart Ablon. And it's a trauma-informed model of care with the goal of helping youth and caregivers resolve differences in expectations rather than trying to modify children's behavior through the application of rewards and punishment. And what's really important is that CPS is based on the premise that challenging behavior occurs when the expectations being placed on a child exceed their capacity to respond adaptively. That some children are lacking these skills to handle certain demands and expectations. And, for quite a while, more than a decade now, CPS model has demonstrated effectiveness with youth with a wide range of social, emotional, and behavioral challenges. And what's really important is that CPS promotes the understanding that challenging kids, or kids with challenging behaviors, lack the skill, not the will, to behave well. And we're talking specifically about skills that relate to problem solving, flexibility, and frustration tolerance. So unlike traditional models of discipline, CPS avoids the use of power, control, and motivational procedures, and focuses on helping building relationships between parents and children and teaching kids the skills they need to succeed. And so I'm not going to go into great detail, but just a little bit about sort of plan A, C, and B as they work with collaborative problem solving. So there's a plan A, which is sort of the typical way that we interact as adults with kids. And that is when adults impose their will to make a child meet their expectations. That's plan A. And the problem with plan A is that it requires sort of these skills I was just mentioning, right? Problem solving, flexibility, to be able to adapt when an expectation is made. And many of the kids that we're talking about don't have these skills. Plan C is when parents decide to drop an expectation. And some people think of this as sort of giving in, but that's not really what we mean. It's not the same thing. Giving in is when a parent tries plan A and they don't get the results they want, and so they just stop. Plan C is when parents are strategic in thinking about the fact that I can't expect my child to do all of these things all at the same time. And so I'm going to think about the things that I want to prioritize for us to focus on now and put the rest on the back burner. That's what we mean when we talk about sort of plan C, is that prioritizing. And then plan B is really the heart of collaborative problem solving. And it's when adults work together with kids to solve problems that are mutually satisfactory and realistic. And the problem begins with identifying triggers to a child's challenging behavior and the skills that they need to develop. The next step is about the child and the parent partnering together to build those skills and come up with solutions that are sort of long-term. CPS helps adults shift to a more accurate and compassionate mindset and embrace the truth that kids do well if they can, rather than what is a more common belief and a mistaken belief that kids will do well if they want to. And that's a really important, I think, difference. Okay, so as I mentioned, CPS focuses on building skills like flexibility, frustration tolerance, and problem solving, rather than simply motivating kids to behave better. And this is one, as I mentioned, that you're going to use generally with your older youth. All right, Lisa, next. Serve and return is a wonderful example of an interaction that parents would have. And this is something that starts from the very earliest ages of infancy, right? So when we talk about serve and return, we're talking about interactions between a parent and child that shape brain architecture. So when an infant or young child babbles or gestures or cries, and an adult responds appropriately with eye contact, words, a hug, neural connections are built in the brain that strengthen the child. So you're building the child's brain, and that supports the development of both communication and social skills. And so it's when we call serve and return, it's very much like the volleying that you see in tennis or ping pong or pickleball, which I've just recently learned about playing. So when caregivers are responsive and sensitive to a young child's signals and needs, they provide an environment that's rich in serve and return. And this isn't just something that happens in infancy. It can start there, but it can happen really throughout childhood. All right, so I'm curious if any of you are familiar with the serve and return. Heard that term before. Lisa, next. And this is an example of sort of how serve and return works. And I know you probably can't read the words here, but essentially what we're talking about is first you notice a child's reaction. Let's say there's a song, you're singing Wheels on the Bus, and the child is smiling or cooing or moving their arms and legs. You notice and you respond with, oh, you like this song, or maybe you're clapping along or whatever. By noticing the serve, you're learning about the child's interests and likes. And then you're returning the serve by encouraging the child and letting them know, oh, I noticed this. I noticed that you like this. This lets the child know that their thoughts and feelings are heard and understood. Let's say the child then starts hand motions. What's your return? You name it. This song is called Wheels on the Bus. I can tell you like it because you're smiling and singing along. And then you take turns again, going back and forth. You do the hand motions, they respond. They do motions, you respond. And then you practice endings and beginnings. So you notice when the child is getting bored or disinterested, and you bring the activity to an end and begin something new. And this serve and return can happen literally hundreds of thousands of times during the course over the years. And it isn't just play. This is important for the development of your child's brain. Next, we'll talk a little bit about attuned parenting. So what is attunement? Well, first of all, attuned parenting really is the foundation for attachment. It is the ability to meet your child's needs when and how they need them met, establishing a foundation for trust, empathy, understanding relationships, and verbal and nonverbal communication. In a sense, it's being tuned into what your child needs, sometimes even before they realize it themselves. And so I wonder if you guys can share in the chat, what are some examples that you have of attunement, or times when you've been maybe attuned to your child? How do you recognize attunement or feel it? So please feel free to share in the chat box.
How do you know when you're in tune with your child?
Yeah, how do you know? And I think, things that are important to remember about attuned parenting, is you're imparting meaning to the child's inner world of body signals, right? You're attending to both the verbal and the nonverbal. Oh, here's a great example. I've seen it, but have not used it yet. So one person said when they are hungry, so right, when they're hungry, if they say I'm hungry, or maybe they cry if they're children and you respond. When she feels heard, I can tell when my son is anxious and I'm able to help him with it. So this is a great example of that anticipation, right? You kind of know that maybe there are certain things that can be triggering, and so you pay attention to that. And so we appreciate that you hit the caps and you weren't angry. We understand that. And then the thing about attuned parenting and building this attachment is that it teaches children that others recognize their needs and are responsive to them. And again, this is about building that sort of foundation of trust, right? That when I have a need, it's going to be met. And then that helps develop empathy for children as well.
Yeah, I'm done. So Bonnie says, when I can tell there's something deeper going on beyond the behavior. So maybe noticing if a child is, you know, you get a sense of their energy, right? If they're feeling sad or lonely or angry.
Or a child's screaming and you know it's not because you turned off the TV, it's really about something else. And figuring out what that is and attending to that.
Yeah.
Great examples. Understand what is the best way to communicate a need to them, right? So sometimes we know that we have to change how and when we share information because we're attentive and attuned to what our children's sort of state is in the moment. And when you stay with them and want to be near, even when they push away and are prickly. That's a great example, Sue. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. I want to talk just a minute about the adult attachment interview. So this is a particular interview that helps identify attachment styles for parents. And it was developed in the 1980s by Mary Maynard, who was involved in doing what's called the strange situation study. And if you haven't taken the Nti training, we talk a little bit about this, certainly in the attachment module. But the idea is that a parent with an insecure attachment style is unlikely to be able to help her child securely attach, right? So if a parent isn't securely attached, it's hard for them to help their child develop that secure attachment. The adult attachment interview includes about 20 specific questions which explore the adult's attachment experiences as a child with their own parents. And the rating scales reflect the parent's current state of mind related to their own attachment experiences with both parents. And so you can see on the screen some of the kinds of questions that the attachment interview addresses. And this can be sort of a wonderful tool to really understand, particularly if you're working with like prospective adoptive parents, to understand, you know, kind of what were their experiences growing up and where are they in terms of their attachment style. So things like, why do you think your parents behaved as they did during your childhood? Or list 5 adjectives or phrases to describe your relationship with your mom and your dad. So take a minute to consider these questions for yourself. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts you're interested or willing to share in the chat box about what you think these kinds of questions might mean or might say about attachment.
Yeah, and maybe also why it's important to know your own attachment style, or if you're working with families, why it's important for them to know their attachment style.
Right. Do you think it would make a difference in working in their interactions with their children? Do you want to go on to the next slide and then we can come back and take a look at the chat?
Sure.
Okay. So we're going to talk just a few minutes about, so Bonnie's saying it might show if a parent has experienced trauma as a child that affected their attachment style as an adult. It's a great example. It makes a difference, and then make sure our self-care needs are met. So absolutely. And we're going to talk also a little bit later on about things like unresolved grief and how that might also impact attachment with a child. So really important point.
Yeah. Monica says, I have attachment issues from my childhood and I know how it affected my parenting. And absolutely, we pass this along, right? If we're not feeling secure and attuned and safe, we pass that on in our parenting for sure.
And then Jennifer saying, what I notice often is how a person was raised or treated or interacted with, good or bad, tends to shape how they parent their own children and form relationships with others. And I think that's a wonderful point, Jennifer. And I think you're making the point that we're making, that having an understanding of this can make a huge difference in a parent's ability or in a worker's ability to help a parent to do a better job of attaching. All right, so this is the case with Zoe. We're going to kind of read through this briefly and then talk a little bit about, you know, what could have been done differently maybe that would have helped Zoe. So first of all, Zoe has a maltreatment history. Zoe and her 2 sisters were removed from her mother at age 4 due to medical physical neglect. Zoe's father was reported to be abusive. After removal, Zoe was placed in a children's shelter with her sister for 8 days. She returned home before being removed again, returning to the shelter before being placed in a foster home. She and her sisters were eventually placed with their grandmother, then to another resource home. At 7 years old, Zoe's mother died. At 8 years old, Zoe and her sisters reported being sexually abused by their older sister. Zoe's birth father's rights were terminated when she was 9. So Zoe's had a total of 51 placements. So Zoe's obviously older now, has had a total of 51 placements before going to a pre-adoptive home. Near finalization, Zoe started acting out, no longer wanted to be adopted, began looking for her family through social media. So I want you to think about Zoe. Zoe's had all of these early traumas and adverse experiences, broken attachments, multiple placement moves. And I want you to think about, what does that say and how does that impact her readiness now to move to what we would call permanency with a new family, with an adoptive family? So think about that for just a second. All right, so next slide. So what is it that happens when this early attunement isn't present or is chaotic, as in Zoe's example? You know, consider the impact of the child's early attachment experiences on felt safety. So does Zoe feel safe? And we don't just mean physically safe. Does Zoe have the ability to really feel safe in her own skin, where she lives, what she's doing? Does she feel emotionally safe? What about her brain development? You know, she's had these multiple traumas over time. How is that impacting her brain development? Chances are she didn't get the serve and return kinds of interactions that we would want children to have early on, right? What about her self-regulation capacity, right? Is she able to manage her feelings? Maybe not. She didn't have models for that, certainly. What about her social, emotional, physical, cognitive, language development? Again, we talk about how attunement is the foundation for attachment, and those things are what help build, right, these skills for later on in life. What about her sense of self-worth? We've already talked, you heard Lisa talk about self-concept and trauma, probably not in a great place. And again, her willingness to attach to future caregivers. So if she doesn't have all those other things, how is she going to be successful, right, with this new adoptive family?
And
So
Bonnie,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was going to say, Bonnie says she doesn't know what it is to feel safe. And exactly. I think, yeah, that's so true. Think about being in 51 placements. Yeah. 51. Why would she feel safe? How could she possibly feel attached to anything? Right. How could she trust her future?
Well, she was abused by parents, and she was maltreated by parents, and then abused by an older sister, and moved around from place to place. Where is the base from which she's able to develop, right, those kinds of social, emotional, cognitive skills and her readiness? It's a very scary thought. And yet Zoe, you know, not all of our kids have had 51 placements, but Zoe is not unlike a lot of our kids. It doesn't take 51 placements. That's not really the issue, right? It's all the other stuff.
Yeah, Jennifer says she probably feels like if she goes to another place, she'll just get moved again. So why bother?
Yeah. Well, and you know, you think about a lot of older kids who say, you know, I don't want to be adopted. Why would they not want to be adopted? It's pretty obvious when you think about it from this perspective, right? Like what do they have to lose? They don't think they have anything to lose because they've never had any of that security to begin with. So they don't even know what it means to have a family, nor do they have the ability to even, what is the word? Like, be vulnerable enough to accept that it might not work, right? Because it's never worked before. It's never been successful. So I want you to think about what might have been done to heal trauma, facilitate attachment in Zoe's case. Any thoughts that you have about what could have made a difference?
And Kathy says she may feel comfortable with chaos because that's all she knows. Absolutely. Her body and brain are wired for chaos.
And when you think about that, Kathy, it's much easier to understand why when kids are in placements and they do things that blow the placement. And I hate this term because it sounds blameful, right? That kids are blowing their placements. But when things start to get close and emotional, it is natural for people who haven't got that felt safety to want to push away and to make sure that it doesn't become too vulnerable for them. So great examples.
Yeah, it's self-protective.
Absolutely. So ways to encourage attachment. So I will just say, obviously, serve and return, we talked about a minute ago, is a great example of the kinds of things that can be helpful to develop this attachment. Responding to the arousal relaxation cycle. So this is when, a need is identified, child cries, says they're hungry, and that need is met. And then the child gets in this relaxation phase. Having this cycle be completely finished every time starts to build for children that sense of safety, felt safety. Initiating positive interactions. And this is really tough for parents in particular who have kids with really challenging behaviors, right? You spend so much time focusing on the behavior that it's easy to forget that we just sometimes need to have basic positive interactions, recognizing good things that happen, praising kids when things, aren't chaotic and crazy, making sure that you find time to just do things that are pleasurable, whether it's watching TV together or going to have ice cream or any of those things. And then claiming behaviors. And by claiming behaviors, we're talking about the kinds of behaviors that tell children, I'm your parent and you're my child. Like, we belong together, right? We're attached to each other. All right, so I think, Lisa, you're up next.
Okay, all right.
Real quick, Sue is saying needs being met equals safety and trust building. And that's absolutely the point that we're making. So thank you, Sue. And recognizing the good within the child despite the chaos going on in their lives. And this is so important for kids, right? Who already have all this negativity going on in their heads. All right.
For sure. Yeah. I like going out for cotton candy. I haven't had cotton candy in a long time. I like that picture.
I know. I love cotton candy.
Yeah, I know. So, so all of the things that we've talked about so far, the attunement, the adult attachment interview, the serve and return, and Tbri, which we're going to talk about in a moment, all of these interventions are built into the Nti training. And again, you're not going to get trained on Tbri or trained on to be an expert in serve and return, although for a lot of us that might be sort of instinctual. But these are their skills and knowledge that are built into the training. And then we've got lots and lots of resources that send you off looking into more information, more learning about these different interventions. Lots of links, lots of papers, lots of tip sheets and all kinds of things. So you can learn a little bit more. So we're going to talk about Tbri, trust-based relational intervention. It's an evidence-based intervention intended to help parents, caregivers, and others working with children from hard places and at risk for potential attachment problems to focus on the whole child and to promote connection with the child. Some of you might be familiar with Karen Purvis. She was one of the founders of this, developers of this Tbri. She has since passed, but there's an agency that's dedicated to training and information about Tbri. If you put in Tbri or trust-based relational intervention in Google, you'll get lots of information if you wanted to take a peek at that before exploring the Nti training. So Tbri defines 3 groups of guiding principles: empowering principles to address safety and physical needs, which lay the foundation, right? That's going to lay the foundation for our work with kids, our parenting of children. The second is connecting principles for attachment needs, building a trusting relationship. That attachment is so critical to child development, forming attachments. Really, that trust is so very important. And the third is correcting principles to disarm fear-based behaviors and teach desirable behaviors. So how do we address the unwanted behaviors? Again, as Don was saying, the can't versus won't behaviors, what's going on underneath. We're going to take a look at what's underneath and disarm those behaviors. So the guiding principles are explained as such. Empowering principles lay the foundation for change, for felt safety, self-regulation, self-awareness, the sensory needs for the child, celebrating your child's needs. You know, oh my gosh, sweetheart, you asked me for a cookie because you're hungry and you need something sweet. Okay, we're gonna like give them permission to share those needs, and we'll celebrate them. Creating some predictability, making the day predictable. A lot of our kids who've experienced trauma just cannot handle change. It throws them into that fight or flight response. They get really, really scared. How do we share power? Sort of, again, going back to, I'm sorry, the CPS model, right? How do you do the power sharing? That was the plan B in CPS, sharing and bringing balance and structure and nurture into the family. The connecting principles are building a trusting relationship, connecting through play, through eye contact, through that attunement, knowing what your child needs, sometimes even before they know what they need, respecting a child's need for personal space sometimes. Maybe they don't want to be held and cuddled. Maybe they just need a little time by themselves. Setting a bar for success, praising, working together to solve problems. Again, sort of similar to CPS, right? Giving voice to your child. So reflective listening, empathy, encouraging your child to express and sort of naming what's going on for them, helping them to name it. And then following through on promises. We say we're going to do something and we're going to do it. And then finally, the corrective principles are disarming fear-based behaviors and teaching desirable behaviors. So scripting the new, using short, direct phrases to teach children positive social skills and life values, using a teaching approach with a balance of structure and nurture to change behavior and share power, offering chances to redo. Hey, sweetie, do you want to do that again? That wasn't a great response. Maybe we'll try it over. We'll get a do-over. Supporting the child's self-image. Wow, you did that really great that time. I'm so proud of you. And avoiding labeling, blaming, and shaming really doesn't serve any good purpose in parenting or in working with a child. Taking time in instead of time out. Time out often makes a child feel as if you are abandoning them again. We don't want to abandon an abandoned child. And then the second part of Tbri talks about this ideal response. The response to a child's behavior, to a child's situation is immediate, so happening within a few seconds. It's direct, fully present to the child, making eye contact. Hey, baby, what's going on? Tell me what's going on. It's efficient. The parents match the level of response to the child's response. What this says to me is finding a way to get, to do that co-regulation, right? Not responding with hysteria if your child's having a temper tantrum, but finding a way to get that energy level a little bit tempered, bringing it down. And then it's action-based. When a child acts the right behavior or the desired behavior, giving that a positive response, giving that a positive reinforcement. And then it starts to become motor memory. It starts to become, oh wait, if I do it this way, I'm gonna get that positive redo. Okay, so the ideal response. I just want to take a peek at the chat box here.
I was going to say, Bonnie mentioned that she's done a 4-day training from Karen Purvis on Tbri, which is great. Rose says keeping their routine as normal as possible is so important, and I think that's certainly reinforced here. And then Sue mentioned, interesting how sometimes praise is responded to negatively, maybe when trust hasn't been built yet. So
Yeah, Sue, that's a really good point. When you say, oh my gosh, you did such a great job, and your child starts, screaming and throwing things, right? I did not. No, I didn't. You can't tell me. I think they don't trust themselves, and they don't trust that you're being genuine. And so taking the time to build that trust and not to sort of dissuade them, oh, yes, you are. You're so wonderful. It's sort of like when somebody has that body dysmorphic disorder, that negative view of their body. When you say, oh my gosh, but you're so pretty, it's not helpful, right? Because they already don't believe it. They don't trust you, and they don't trust themselves in that. Yeah. So Bonnie's saying when taking the time to listen how a change in routine is affecting the child, right? Because sometimes we have to do things that are out of the ordinary. So we're going to talk a little bit about loss and grief and the role it plays in families formed through adoption, guardianship, kinship care, foster care, and how it has a significant impact on attachment and the mental health of children. We're going to talk about ambiguous and unresolved losses, things that are hiding underneath, things that we might not sort of be aware of, that oftentimes present as manipulative behavior or obstinate defiant behavior. We're going to look at some strategies and evidence-informed therapies embedded in NTI to help professionals and parents support children who are grieving, and maybe recognizing the grieving to begin with, and then help them in their grief to mitigate the loss and help children, youth, and families uncover hope and healing. And again, this is another place where it can be that we have some unresolved loss in our own lives. So being aware of both and. Unresolved loss is really hard. Ambiguous loss is really hard. Because of the ambiguity, there's hope of reconciliation oftentimes. I don't know where I am. I don't know where I'm going. I think I'm going to go back to my mom, so I don't need a new family. Oftentimes we hear kids say this, I don't want to be adopted. I'm going to go back to my mom. She's going to get it together. She's going to get help. She's going to get money, right? Whatever the child perceives is keeping the mom from getting back in touch, getting her child back. So when there's this lack of knowledge, when there's this lack of understanding about what's real, what's happening for a child, there's a feeling of limbo, sort of in limbo, don't know what's going to happen. And so I'm going to hope that I'm going back home. And with this hope, children and youth can't really grieve because they haven't fully recognized the loss. It hasn't been acknowledged to a great degree. And this unresolved loss, unresolved grief, interferes with forming new attachments, which makes sense, right? If a child thinks, oh, I'm only here for a few days or a few weeks or whatever, I'm going to go back to my mom. I don't need to attach to this family. They're not my family. I don't want to be here. I'm not going to be here. So it's hard on everybody. It's difficult for the child to integrate all parts of their life while holding on to a hope for return home. And sometimes it's, we don't want to sort of set kids off, right? Oftentimes in the work in child welfare and mental health, and I've heard this from professionals, they're doing okay right now. I don't want to set off any alarms and have them start misbehaving when I tell them the truth that their, mom's rights were terminated and he's never going home. It really, it's easier for the adults in the moment, but it's really not easier for the child. And they can't integrate all of their parts when they don't know what's going on. The grief oftentimes shows up in behaviors, manipulative, defiant. They run away, try to get out of there, right? So whether or not there is contact with the birth family, we really need to help children with clarifying their relationships and resolve the ambivalence. We have to help them grieve. And grief is hard. It's not fun. Grief is gut-wrenching and painful. And it's really important to do. Ambiguous loss often looks like PTSD. So oftentimes we have a kid in care and they've gotten the diagnosis of PTSD, and we don't really recognize that it's their loss and grief that's showing up. It shows up in transitions and changes. They have difficulty making decisions or making choices, often have difficulty making positive choices. They often feel overwhelmed, can't cope with loss. Well, they really don't know how to process it. We haven't done an adequate job of helping them learn how to cope with loss. Disappointments are really hard. And the coping with losses, I just want to say just quickly, it's not necessarily a loss of their family, but loss of a girlfriend or a boyfriend in high school, loss of a game. I lost my wallet. And these things become so overwhelming, and lots of behaviors can come from that as well. That depression or anxiety, feelings of helplessness or hopelessness, and feelings of guilt. I'm the one who did this. I caused this to happen. So Colleen Boss, who's an expert in loss, talks about the greater ambiguity surrounding one's loss, the more difficult it is to master, and the greater one's depression, anxiety, and family conflict. The more ambiguity there is, the harder it is. So consider what it might mean for a child who's been removed from their birth family, whether it's at birth, whether it's later in life in their elementary school years or in their teen years. They're removed and didn't have a choice in this. What might that feel like? What does that ambiguous loss feel like for the child or the teen? You can put your thoughts in the chat box. So let's think about it. What does it feel like to be torn away? In the Nti training, there's a video that's called, I think it's called I Was Tooken. Is that right, Don? Something like that. I was tooken. And that child sensed that they were almost like kidnapped. Is that what the video is, Don?
Yeah, it's I Was Tooken. And they could talk about this feeling of being taken away, and how, not knowing anything about what happened or why they were taken away or where they were going or where their parents were or were they ever going to see their parents again. And if you think about often how our system works, we think we're making a decision to remove a child for safety reasons, and that's obviously very important. But the child doesn't know what's going on. They don't understand why that decision is made. And we often perpetuate it because we don't have that information, right? We're moving you to a safe place, but it doesn't feel safe to them because they don't know anything about that safe place, right? So you think about it from their perspective. So Monica's saying kids would feel lost, powerless.
Yeah, for sure. And through our pilot of Nti, we learned that oftentimes the professionals who are working with children who are moving a child from one place to another didn't feel like they could or should talk to a child about why they were being moved. Right. And so that just adds to that feeling of ambiguity and like, where am I and what's happening? Yeah. And the fact is, we need to talk to kids about why they're moving. Mm-hmm. If we've taken them out of an unsafe situation, we could talk about their safety. There are ways to talk with kids about what's happening to them in age-appropriate ways, and we ought to be doing that. And Nti really provides a lot of tools and skills around that work too. Yeah, without realizing what's going on with mom and dad. Mom and dad even alive still.
Right.
Yeah, feeling fault and desperation, Sue says. Yeah. So we're going to try a little exercise here, and you all might have seen this before. You might have come across this in your work or in other trainings, but in case you haven't, we're going to just give this a little go. So if you will, take out a pencil and a piece of paper, or pen and paper, and we're going to just give you a little scenario here. So maybe take a moment. settle in. You might close your eyes, like do this little experiential with us. So you're sitting in your living room. You're sitting in your living room here in Rochester. It's a nice sunny day. And all of a sudden there's a knock on the door. And you go to the door, you're not expecting anyone. And you go to the door and you open it. And a woman tells you, you're moving. You've got 10 minutes to pack up. And you got to pack up 10 items or people to take with you. Only 10. You've got 10 things that you can take with you, people or items. And you've just got, you got to do this real quick. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes to figure out which 10 things you're going to take with you because you're moving. We got to keep this going here. So write down on your piece of paper 10 things you're going to take with you. 10 things or people. What 10 things would you take? What 10 things do you not want to be without? So now you've got your list. And again, just take a moment and close your eyes and you've got your 10 things you've got ready. And the woman comes in the room and she says, you know what? Sorry, just not enough room in the truck. You're going to have to remove 5 items or people from your list here. You can't take it all with you. You can take 5. So take the time, take a moment and cross 5 things off your list. How do you choose? What do you choose? And no fair adding something else and taking that off. Okay, now you're down to 5. Yeah, but wait. Yeah, sorry. Still can't fit what we've got. Not going to be able to take it. You've got to remove 3 more things from your list. So there's 2 things that you're going to be able to take with you. Just 2. So cross out 3 more. Get your little list down to 2. No room for anything besides yourself and these 2 items. So usually when it gets down to this last 2, that's a really hard choice for most people. So how are you feeling about this exercise? There's a quick response. Yeah, one thing that would have really hurt, I wouldn't be able to take my animal. That would have been awful. Dora says, not feeling good. Tina, like I lost everything. Yeah. Stressed. Oh my gosh, what should I take? How do I know? Bonnie, it's not fair. And yes, kids go through this every time they move.
Got it.
Yeah. Gutted. Oh,
Yeah.
Mandy, you feel that? Yeah. Yeah. Most people, when they do this exercise in a training, choose to take loved ones, right? Those are the things that come down on the list, the last things. Our kids don't get to take loved ones. They don't get to take people. They're not given any choice whatsoever about taking people or pets. I worked with a kid once who wanted to take a rock that he found, and the caseworker was like, you don't need that rock. Why would you take that rock? You don't have to take that rock. And it, it was like, a small rock. You can't take that rock. I mean, come on. These kids get attached to things. They can't take anything else. They can't take the people. They can't take their pets, their dog or their cat or their goldfish even, right? Oftentimes we don't even let them take a goldfish. I've done this exercise a number of times. Don and I have done it in training, and Edna, my partner in crime and implementation specialties are, we've done this, and this is a painful exercise, and we're just playing, right? This is just a game for us. This is real for our kids. This is real for our kids. So just finally to say that this is a really good exercise. This loss exercise is a really good exercise to do with prospective foster and adoptive families. It's great to do if you're working on a team, to sort of get into the feeling of what it's like to lose things, what it's like to be moved and not given a choice. So we talked a lot about unacknowledged, unresolved loss and grief. Any other thoughts about this? Any thoughts about unresolved, unacknowledged, or unsupported grief? Understanding loss and grief in the context of developmental stages. We talk about this in the Nti training. And sometimes a child's reaction in grief seems like, seems sort of extreme, or, oh my goodness, they should have been over this already. But it really is impacted by their developmental stage. As children get older, their understanding changes, and so they might have new reactions to loss. Infants and toddlers revisit the loss many times over as their cognitive abilities change. I'm an adoptive parent, and we talked in my family about adoption probably more than my kids appreciated, but it's been my work for a very long time. And I remember just hitting those different developmental stages, and my kids were like, wait a minute, I was adopted. What happened? Somebody had lost my whole family? My son said to me, what, nobody in all of Korea wanted me? How could that be? So that different understanding at different stages.
All right, I think this is me.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so let's look at strategies and some evidence-informed kind of tools and therapies that are embedded in the Nti training to help professionals and parents support grieving children, to mitigate losses, and to help children and youth uncover hope and healing. And as I mentioned before, there is no one comprehensive evidence-based treatment. And so the point here really is to find the tools that work for you, and to know, that families can use a whole range of interventions, from sort of the easiest, most basic, which would be psychoeducation information, to complex sort of behavior kinds of behavioral interventions for challenging behavior. All right, so here. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about treatment that focuses on building and rebuilding attachments, that helps parents learn therapeutic parenting strategies, and that fosters healing from complex trauma. So David Brzezinski, those of you who aren't familiar with him, Dr. David Brzezinski, in his book, Being Adopted, talks about grief and loss for adopted children using a metaphor of keeping losses in a box. So sometimes you keep the box closed, sitting in a corner without much thought. Other times you feel like opening the box, peeking inside, exploring the losses, and then you close it up. The box is always there, sitting in the corner, sometimes out of sight, but sometimes it's right there in front of you. So a loss box is something that can be used to help young people express and contain their losses, to honor their losses and gain mastery over them, and ultimately offer a way to find symbolic closure to move on. And so the idea is that you would take a box, you could decorate it, and then the child can actually put things in the box that would symbolize their losses. They can be actual, tangible things like pictures. They can be symbolic things like rocks, whatever. But that helps them sort of contain their losses, and they can revisit them over time. All right, next one, telling the story. So we talk a lot in Nti about how important it is for children to understand and be able to tell their story. So we want to help children learn, process, and understand their story because it is integral to minimizing the impact of this ambiguity, right? The more they know about their story, the less ambiguous it's going to be. The more information, the better. No matter how hard the information, and of course we assume the information is age and developmentally appropriate. But we want you to remember that it's their story. And so we have several tools to support that. Things like life books, digital stories, which are like little video vignettes that are created. And then on the next slide, we're going to talk about storyboarding. So this is one particular technique or strategy that can be used. We provide access to a tool called Storyboard That. It's a website where you can actually work with a young person to create a storyboard, where every block is sort of a scene of the story. You can use images, pictures, words to really help create the story. And when you're working with a young person, you can sort of help them think about a point in time and kind of move forward from that. Sometimes they can even just sort of talk about not themselves, but a sort, maybe it's their story, but they're putting somebody else in the picture, if you will. And the interesting thing about this, or the important thing about storyboarding, is this is not necessarily about creating a story that reports the truth, right? Sometimes there's the truth and there's the truth that children have about their own story. This is really about eliciting the feelings, the thoughts that the children have about their own story, not correcting the story so that it's true. There's time for that later, but this helps you understand where they're coming from. Next slide, we talk a little bit about rituals and activities that you can do with your child to acknowledge losses over time. So things like celebrating birth Mother's Day, or on Mother's Day, putting a candle on the cake for birth mother, or it could be writing a letter, say it's like a goodbye letter, creating a memory box where the child can put little mementos that help them remember the people who are important to them. Having a picture of somebody important in their life on their bedside table, maybe it's their birth mother or grandmother or whomever. And again, the idea here is helping them give voice to their own experiences. So I'm wondering, in your own experience, professional or personal, what kinds of strategies have you used, rituals or activities that you've done with children that help them sort of hold on to those memories and honor those losses? Feel free to put that in the chat. Oh, so I mentioned this earlier. So when we're talking about loss and grief work, it's really important that we ourselves as adults know our own triggers. And it's really important for us to understand that because all of us have experienced some losses in our life, that we have to be aware if we have unresolved or unacknowledged losses ourselves, because we can be triggered by the grief and the loss that our children are experiencing. If we haven't resolved those losses, they're going to come back to haunt us in a sense. And we need to be able to manage our own grief so that we can help our children manage and heal from theirs as well. When we as professionals or parents react out of our grief, it can be frightening to children, it can challenge their sense of safety, and it can interfere with the attachment that obviously we're focused on wanting to build. So, I guess what I would say here is you need to be aware of yourself. And if you have unresolved losses, ambiguous losses of your own, it might be a good time to make sure that you have someone who can support you in doing that healing work yourself, so that you can be the best self for your children as well. And that would be true for professionals as well. In the professional capacity, if you're not dealing with your own, you can't really help your kids manage theirs as well. All right, so Lisa, I think the next one is yours.
Yep. So just want to sort of reiterate that built into NTI, there are quite a number of practice models that you can get more information on. These on this list are just, a couple of them. DDP, Dyadic Developmental Psychotherapy, Theraplay, ABC. We have a whole alphabet soup of interventions that are built into NTI. with lots of resources and lots of links to getting this information. And again, this is all, you find this right in our training. The other thing I want to say about our the information that's in the training and the resources and the tools and the skills that are in the training, everything has been vetted by experts across the country, and we had a really exceptional panel of experts who worked on this with us, who did review. The writers are exceptional. We've had people like Darla Henry and Joseph Crumbly and David Brzezinski. I mean, these are the gurus in adoption and permanency work across internationally as well as nationally. And all of the information that's built into this, all of the tools and strategies are downloadable, and then you can share them with your colleagues, with your families, and with your work in with just one-to-one with kids. So just resource rich for you to use as soon as you learn it. So really, really dig deep into those things. Yes, we'll get you a copy of all the slides for sure. Okay.
They may be available on the HUVA site, but we'll double check and make sure.
Yeah, actually they are. We did pass those along. We uploaded those to the HUVA site. Thank you for that. I always forget about that site.
And then real quick, Lisa, I just want to say that on the previous slide, you listed some particular mental health interventions. But as you've seen just through today's, we also have strategies. You don't have to be a mental health therapist to be able to benefit from NTI, right? We have lots of strategies and tools that you can use in your work with parents, with children, with families, for both folks who are mental health therapists and those who aren't. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So anyway, Deb in her follow-up talks about how important it was to work with a mental health specialist who said, come on in the room, you've got to be here. Healing happens in family. Healing happens in relationship. And the relationship should not be with the therapist. The relationship has to be with the parents. If the parent doesn't know what's going on in the therapy, how are they supposed to deal with any of the issues? And that's not to say especially for our teenagers, that they can't have a place to share some things that are personal and confidential. That can happen. But again, healing in context of the family is what we really want to be focusing on. And Deb says, having worked with an adoption competent therapist was like night and day. It was like night and day. It made all the difference in their family. And she talks about how it really did help to keep her family together. So just wrapping up with a little bit about NTI, a little bit more about NTI. We've been talking about it all along. NTI was created to advance practice for permanency and well-being. So the training, as we've talked about, is for child welfare professionals and mental health professionals, but it really runs the gamut from the time anybody who works with a child who is entering the system to far after post-adoption services. We talk a lot about what it's like to be a young adult and have been adopted. What is it like to reconnect with birth family, negotiating those relationships? The training is designed to support children to heal from trauma and loss and to build coping skills. And again, lots of these skills are built right into the training to provide child welfare and mental health professionals tools and strategies designed to help build and rebuild healthy attachments. Attachment is the core, really at the core of this for sure. And to provide parents with skills to facilitate attachment and to parent more effectively, to keep their families intact and hope and healing, keeping that in the forefront. Any last questions? Yeah.
Tina has her hand raised.
Okay.
Oh, Laurie.
Laurie?
Yeah. Laurie, then Tina.
Thanks. So earlier on, you showed a slide. I think you partly just answered it when you're talking about you teach skills for parents as well. But when you're talking about the child welfare curriculum that was 20 hours long and the mental health curriculum that was 30 hours long, which one would you recommend for us as family peer support partners? Which one would be more beneficial for us?
Great question.
That's a great question. So actually you could take either one. So the 20-hour child welfare one provides a really strong, wonderful overview of sort of how to do casework with families and children. So it's much more casework focused. The mental health one is more clinically focused. So you're going to have more information that relates to assessment and treatment planning. And we do provide in the child welfare one some of the therapeutic parenting strategies. So some of what we talked about will be in that one as well. So if you take the 20-hour child welfare one, you're going to get a great, strong foundation, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I know we're in a bit of a time crunch here. We've got 2 minutes left. So I just want to show you how to access NTI. It's super simple. And Dawn, if you want to put our website in the chat box. Terrific.
It's in the chat box, and I just want to let folks know we're moving to a new learning management system that we hope to have live on Monday. So if you would give us a couple days before you try to access the training, we just need to make sure everything is live and working. But you can access NTI via our learning management system or the Kaplan Online Training Center, which is free and funded by the federal government. We also have a directory for trained mental health professionals who've taken the training across the country. So if you're interested in finding someone in your neck of the woods, you can certainly go to our directory as well. And finally, this is our contact information.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. If you've got other questions, we'd be happy to talk with you. Just email us. Our contact information is also available through the WUVA app. And I'm sure if you couldn't find us, Kelsey would be able to give you some more information. We thank you so much. I know we've got a drop dead time at 3:15 because there's more sessions coming.